This is a great question, and essentially it boils down to why does it seem like we in the US are supporting external nations such as Taiwan or Ukraine more than what seems like the American public? Which is kind of an interesting question because the US actually spends roughly 6 trillion on domestic programs and services versus 300 billion on foreign aid and partnerships. In fact, according to the World Economic Forum, the US ranks 10th in total domestic social spending as a percentage of GDP, which puts them actually ahead of Canada and the Netherlands, and that actually even surprised me. But the question is, why not isolate? And it's a valid question, but the fact of the matter is US involvement overseas is an investment against future risk and costs. The reason the US developed by far the most powerful military in the history of the world after World War II, with the capability to send its military overseas in an expeditionary capacity to fight wars over there instead of over here, is so we wouldn't have to endure the physical and economic destruction of World War II again in the form of World War III. And if you remember, the US was isolationist before World War I and then again before World War II. And as such, a little over 500,000 Americans died in those two wars after we had to get involved. Basically, it's fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. The US realized that it was the only country in a position to globally stabilize the world, which provided huge benefits to the world, but also the average American. Now, the US is a key player in the global economy. Obviously, it's the biggest economy in the world. It's the most integrated economy when it comes to inputs and total influence. Isolationism by the US could disrupt international trade and economic relations, leading to negative impacts both domestically and worldwide. The US economy benefits from trade, foreign investment, and global supply chains, and retracting from these can lead to economic downturns and job losses. In fact, some 42 million American jobs depend on the stable flow of international trade. Disrupt that due to wars or whatnot, and we would see a major downturn. Not only that, partnering with other countries such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc., has major economic benefits for enhancing capabilities and wealth of the U.S. worker. Similar to how the U.S. saw the Marshall Plan as benefiting the U.S. along with Europe after World War II, our strategic partnerships overseas in the Pacific and really around the world benefit Americans more than they can see right in front of their face. But they certainly would see it if it were disrupted. In fact, we saw it disrupted during COVID and it became problematic. Many of these countries we partner with are major investors in the US, and we want to maintain their stability so they continue to invest in the US. A reduction in investment in our companies and our government bonds would lead to a painful downturn for many Americans. The US dollar is the most globally integrated and dominant currency in the world, but a war abroad impacts not only the dollars that are flowing across the global trade, but could impact both in an upwards trend or a downwards trend the dollars in your wallet. There's also the national security risks. Engagement in global affairs is often seen as crucial for national security. Isolationism by the U.S. can lead to a lack of influence in global matters, as we saw pre-World War I and pre-World War II, which potentially allows threats to grow unchecked. The U.S. drawdowns in Europe emboldened Russia to move on Ukraine in 2014. For instance, things like terrorist groups or even hostile nations might expand their influence if the U.S. withdraws from strategic regions or alliances. And we saw this as Russia became more emboldened and invaded Ukraine as they watched the U.S. depart Europe. If the U.S. came off the board as a major player in the global security stability realm, who fills that void? Is it China? Is it Russia? And I'm not even talking about caring about the nations that would be directly impacted by a Chinese or Russian rise in the face of a U.S. retreat from the global stage. I'm talking about these countries growing unchecked and becoming more and more of a problem for the U.S. when they become so strong that they impact U.S. economic trade and they start making aggressive plays on U.S. assets around the globe, whether it's in the Pacific or Africa or Eastern Europe or wherever. Isolationism can lead to a vacuum of leadership that's potentially filled by other nations whose interests are not the same as ours, whose values might not align with those in the U.S. and its allies. We would almost certainly see a major explosion in authoritarianism across the globe as Russia and China rush to fill the voids left by the U.S. in places like South America, which are our neighbors. Africa, Asia, and Europe as well, all of which could, or probably more likely would, in the future put the US at a far greater strategic disadvantage. But furthermore, we would have to sit and watch atrocities being committed by those countries across the globe and understand that while we could do something, we are choosing not to, which could lead to unchecked humanitarian rights abuses. We've seen both China and Russia execute their own versions of human rights abuses, whether it's in their own countries with the Uyghurs, whether it's with Hong Kong, whether it's with Tibetan monks in China, whether it's with Russia and Ukraine or their own people. It can lead to conflicts and humanitarian disasters, and the U.S. often plays a role in peacekeeping and aid efforts. And I'm not comfortable with just saying, well, it doesn't affect me, so what do I care about that country? We said that in the initial stages of World War II when the Holocaust started, knowing full well that it was taking place. Furthermore, international collaboration and cooperation between countries is vital in the fields like science, technology, and health. And while the U.S. is a leader in global technology, it's not the sole leader. Countries like Netherlands, Estonia, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, all clear and all have an enormous part in integrating into the United States and their tech industries. But part of this is so big that the average American just don't see it. They don't see all of this integration where the Netherlands develops the fabrication systems for semiconductors that are built in Taiwan, that enter parts that Americans buy that are assembled in places like Japan, while software is developed in Estonia. Americans just don't see that integration like they see what's going on right in front of their faces. And isolationism would hinder the progress made in these areas by limiting the exchange of ideas. And this isn't just limited to technology. You restrict cultural and educational exchanges as well, which are important in fostering mutual understanding and global cooperation. They lead to massive booms in science and art, and like I just said, technology. I mean, you look at the isolated countries such as North Korea, and now, as we see it, Russia becoming more isolated, and they are struggling. It was when China opened up. It was when Russia opened up after the Soviet Union that they grew, that they started to flourish. And the U.S. would not be immune to such a disastrous and painful path were they to walk the path of isolationism, such as the Soviet Union did in the past. And a lot of this is why when we invest in, when we partner with, when we have interoperability with other countries, it may not seem like it, but it is a very, very good thing for the average American.